At around 9,400 meters below the surface of the Pacific Ocean on the morning of January 23, 1960, two men sat crammed inside a steel sphere barely 2 meters wide, and everything suddenly went wrong. A loud bang tore through the cabin, sharp enough that it felt less like a sound and more like a physical blow. Jacques Picard and Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh froze. They had no idea what had just happened, only that somewhere on the vessel, keeping them alive against 1,000 atmospheres of pressure, something had cracked. They checked every gauge, every dial, every indicator they had. Everything read normal, but normal didn't explain the noise. They were already deeper than any human being had ever gone, with roughly 2 more kilometers of black water still stacked above them, and no fast way back to the surface even if they wanted one. Abort now, and risk the ascent with unknown damage, or keep falling toward the bottom of the deepest place on the entire planet, not knowing if the next bang would be the last sound they ever heard. That single terrifying moment, inside a bathyscaphe called the Trieste, was humanity's first real brush with a place so hostile that we still barely understand it today, the Mariana Trench. Getting to that moment took years of preparation. The Trieste had been designed by Auguste Piccard, Jacques' father, a Swiss physicist who had already broken the world altitude record in a high-altitude balloon decades earlier, and who applied many of the same buoyancy principles to deep-sea diving. The U? Hess Navy purchased the vessel in the late 1950s, and by January of 1960 it was finally ready for what engineers had built it to do all along, reach the single deepest point on Earth. Before the dive could even happen, a support ship had to drop hundreds of underwater explosive charges just to map the seafloor accurately enough to know where the deepest point actually was, since ordinary sonar simply couldn't read that far down. Once the target was set, Piccard and Walsh climbed down into the pressure sphere before dawn and began falling through the water at less than 1 meter per second, a speed deliberately kept slow to protect the hull from the very kind of stress that ended up cracking that window anyway. Sunlight disappeared within the first few hundred meters. Radio contact with the surface cut out entirely by around 5.5 kilometers down, and somewhere past 9 kilometers, that bang echoed through the cabin. Nearly 5 hours after they started, the Trieste finally touched down on the floor of the Challenger Deep, the deepest known point on the planet, and Piccard and Walsh became the only two human eyes to ever witness it directly. It wasn't until 2012 that filmmaker James Cameron made a solo descent in a custom-built vertical submersible called the Deep Sea Challenger, spending years developing a vehicle capable of surviving the trip alone, and becoming the third human being in history to touch the floor of the Challenger Deep, and the only one to have ever done it solo. And it wasn't until 2019 that a Texas investor named Victor Vescovo became the fourth person to reach the very bottom, this time diving repeatedly over several weeks in a titanium-hulled submersible called the Limiting Factor, as part of a larger project to visit the deepest point in all 5 of the world's oceans, a feat nobody in history had ever attempted, let alone completed. In one of those 2019 dives, Vescovo's cameras caught something that made headlines around the world for entirely the wrong reason. What appeared to be a plastic bag and candy wrappers resting quietly on the seafloor, nearly 7 miles beneath the surface in a place fewer humans had ever visited than had walked on the moon. We'll come back to exactly how much of our own trash has made it down there, because the answer is genuinely disturbing. But first, it's worth actually understanding the scale of the place we're talking about, because the raw numbers alone are difficult to process properly. The Mariana Trench sits out in the western Pacific Ocean, a few hundred kilometers east of the Mariana Islands, not far from Guam. It's a long, curved scar carved into the ocean floor, stretching roughly 2,550 kilometers, nearly the distance between New York and Los Angeles, shaped almost like a crescent moon cut directly into the seabed. Its deepest point carries its own name, the Challenger Deep, named after the British survey ship that first sounded its depth back in 1875, and it drops down to somewhere around 10,900 meters below the surface. To put that into perspective, Mount Everest stands roughly 8,849 meters tall. If you took Everest and lowered its entire mass into the Challenger Deep, the summit would still sit more than 2 kilometers underwater. You could stack a second mountain directly on top of it and still not break the surface. So how does a hole this deep even form? It comes down to plate tectonics. The Pacific Plate, one of the massive slabs of rock making up Earth's crust, is slowly sliding underneath the smaller Mariana Plate in a process geologists call subduction, an unimaginably slow, grinding collision that has continued for tens of millions of years. The trench itself is essentially the seam left behind by that process. Now really, sit with what that depth actually means for anything trying to survive down there. The pressure at the bottom of the Challenger Deep runs more than 1,000 times what you feel standing at sea level, an amount scientists have compared to roughly 50 jumbo jets stacked directly on top of a single point. A steel submarine hull that wasn't specifically engineered for that exact depth would be crushed almost instantly, like a soda can underfoot. The surrounding water sits barely above freezing, and there is no light down there at all. Not dim light, not a faint glow, genuinely zero. Sunlight typically stops penetrating seawater at around 1,000 meters. The Challenger Deep sits nearly 11 times deeper than that. The temperature hovers only a couple of degrees above freezing, cold enough on its own to slow most biological processes to a crawl, yet somehow not cold enough to stop life from finding a way to persist there anyway. Given all of this, it's honestly remarkable that any manned expedition ever managed to touch the bottom at all, let alone that scientists eventually found something alive waiting for them when they got there. The first strange creature researchers managed to properly document down at those depths became known as the Mariana snailfish. At first glance, it doesn't look like it belongs somewhere this hostile at all. It has a soft, almost gelatinous body, no hard scales, and skin so translucent you can nearly see straight through it, paired with small black eyes that make it look fragile. The kind of animal you'd expect to find in a shallow tide pool, not sitting at the bottom of the deepest trench on the planet. It moves in small, loose clusters along the seafloor, hunting shrimp and other tiny invertebrates that share that same crushing environment. Rather than building a rigid skeleton, it doesn't strictly need down there. The fish relies on cells specifically adapted to function normally under that exact crushing load. Take the pressure away, bring the fish up toward the surface, and that same structure that keeps it alive becomes unstable and begins to fail. Think about what that actually means. This isn't an animal simply tolerating an extreme environment. It's an animal that pressure itself effectively built. Its entire existence is shaped by a force that would destroy almost anything else on Earth. And the Mariana snailfish was really just the first confirmed resident scientists managed to document. It certainly wasn't the strangest. In 2019, researchers exploring the deepest parts of the trench came across something that initially didn't make any sense at all. Down in what's called the Hadal zone, the term used for ocean depths below 6,000 meters, they found shrimp-like creatures called supergiant amphipods, some measuring close to a foot long. For comparison, the amphipods typically found in a shallow reef or tide pool are usually only a few millimeters long, so finding something roughly 100 times larger, sitting at a depth where food is desperately scarce, raised serious questions immediately. In most extreme environments, animals actually trend smaller over time, not bigger, since a smaller body needs far less energy to sustain itself. So why were these particular amphipods going in exactly the opposite direction? When researchers examined their exoskeletons more closely, they found something almost unheard of anywhere in biology: aluminum woven directly into the shell itself. Living things regularly build shells and skeletons out of calcium, silica, or chitin, but incorporating an actual metal like aluminum into body armor is an evolutionary strategy researchers rarely see documented anywhere on the planet. The leading explanation is that these amphipods pull trace amounts of aluminum directly out of the surrounding sediment and chemically convert it into a protective coating layered over their shells, helping guard against the naturally corrosive trench water that would otherwise slowly dissolve an exposed exoskeleton over time. Their lifestyle fits that armor perfectly. Supergiant amphipods are scavengers, eating whatever happens to drift down from the world far above: dead fish, sunken wood, decomposing organic material, and increasingly plastic waste that has sunk all the way to the bottom of the ocean. Researchers have also documented these amphipods using sharp, spiked tails as an active defense against predators, a behavior never once recorded in this species before these particular expeditions. Picture that for a moment: a shrimp-like creature nearly a foot long, wearing metal-reinforced armor it essentially built from the seafloor itself, wielding a spiked tail as a weapon, thriving in one of the most crushing environments found anywhere on Earth. It sounds like something out of a science fiction concept sketch. It's completely real. And it's still not the strangest biology the trench has produced, because at least 3 separate research teams have now recorded similar giant amphipods in different trenches across the Pacific, hinting that this armored, oversized body plan might be a far more common survival strategy in the Hadal zone than anyone originally assumed. Most single-celled organisms are entirely invisible to the naked eye. You need a microscope just to confirm they exist in the first place. In the Mariana Trench, that rule simply doesn't apply. During a 2011 expedition, researchers spotted large, pale structures resting directly on the ocean floor, some measuring over 10 centimeters across, roughly the size of a mango. These organisms are called xenophyophores, and what makes them genuinely strange isn't just their size, it's what they technically are underneath. A xenophyophore is, by definition, a single cell. But unlike a typical cell, which contains exactly one nucleus, a xenophyophore contains many separate nuclei inside that same single cell, which is exactly why biologists describe them as multinucleated. Nobody fully understands how a structure built from a single cell manages to grow this large, while simultaneously surviving crushing pressure and near total darkness in an environment with almost no available food. The leading theory is that the organism's unusually large size might actually be the survival strategy itself. A bigger structure naturally has more surface area, and more surface area means more opportunity to absorb whatever scarce nutrients happen to drift by in an environment where food is desperately limited. Rather than being large, despite the harsh conditions surrounding it, it may genuinely be large precisely because of them. Scientists have since found related organisms clustered across other trenches around the Pacific, suggesting these giant single cells aren't some strange one-off accident, but an entire branch of life that has been quietly thriving in Hadal darkness for far longer than anyone realized. We're only about halfway through everything that has been documented down there so far. Researchers have found a fish whose body is quite literally held together by the same pressure that would crush a submarine, a foot-long shrimp that builds its own metal armor, and a single cell the size of a mango doing the work of an entire organism on its own. And what came next is honestly the part that made even the scientists on these expeditions pause. During a Norwegian-led expedition exploring a region near the trench called the Enigma Seamount, researchers were filming at roughly 3,700 meters down when something drifted directly into frame that nobody on the entire team recognized. It had long, thin, trailing tentacles and a bell-shaped body that stayed almost perfectly still in the surrounding water. Unlike many jellyfish, which actively pulse and drift in search of prey, this creature appeared to be an ambush predator instead, hanging motionless, patiently waiting for something smaller to drift close enough to grab. As the cameras kept rolling, parts of its body appeared to glow faintly in the darkness. That detail led some researchers to suspect it might belong to a known group called Crossoda, while others on the team genuinely suspected they were looking at something entirely new, a species with no name, no formal classification, and no prior scientific record whatsoever. To this day, it has never been officially identified. Sit with that for a second, because it's genuinely easy to let a detail like this slide past without registering it. We have actual video footage, recorded and verified, of a living animal in our own ocean that scientists still cannot definitively name. Meanwhile, entire space agencies operate multi-billion-dollar telescope programs, scanning galaxies trillions of kilometers away, hoping to detect even the faintest chemical signature suggesting life exists somewhere out there, while a glowing, unclassified animal drifts quietly through darkness less than 4 kilometers beneath a research ship, and nobody on the mission can tell you exactly what it is. That's not a knock on the scientists involved. It's really just a reflection of how little of our own planet we've actually managed to explore so far. And that unnamed jellyfish isn't just an isolated oddity, it's a symptom of something much bigger happening throughout the trench. Entire ecosystems thriving down there using a method of generating energy that has absolutely nothing to do with the sun at all. Here's something most of us tend to take completely for granted. Nearly every living thing on the surface of this planet depends either directly or indirectly on sunlight. Plants use it to grow, animals eat those plants or eat other animals that ate those plants, and practically every food chain eventually traces back to the sun somewhere along the line. At the bottom of the Mariana Trench, that entire system breaks down. Sunlight has never reached that far, and it never will. Instead, specialized bacteria living in and around hydrothermal vents convert chemicals like methane and hydrogen sulfide directly into usable energy, essentially performing the same basic function that photosynthesis performs for plants, except using chemistry instead of light. Worms and mollusks then feed off these bacteria, either by eating them directly or by hosting them symbiotically inside their own tissue. Researchers have called colonies like this some of the deepest animal life ever observed on Earth, and they strongly suggest there are entire hidden ecosystems still sitting down there that we simply haven't found yet. Think about what this actually proves. Life on our own planet does not require sunlight to exist. It genuinely never did. That single fact raises an enormous question about what kind of life might currently be surviving on other worlds using this exact same chemical trick. Places like Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, which scientists believe hides a liquid ocean beneath miles of solid ice with hydrothermal activity suspected along its seafloor, or Enceladus, a moon of Saturn, where plumes of water vapor have already been detected erupting directly out of cracks in its icy surface. If chemosynthesis can genuinely sustain entire ecosystems in the crushing darkness of our own ocean, there's really no obvious reason it couldn't be doing the exact same thing right now, beneath the ice of a moon we've barely even begun to properly study. Not far from these vent communities, other trench residents have taken a completely different approach to surviving without any light at all. Researchers have filmed transparent eels gliding through the water near that same Hadal zone, their bodies almost entirely see-through aside from a slightly more solid, fish-like head. These eels hunt in complete darkness by relying on sensitive body structures rather than eyesight, since there is genuinely no light down there for eyes to process in the first place. Covering large sections of the surrounding seafloor is a thick, almost carpet-like layer of bacteria, which breaks down dead sea creatures and drifting organic material that slowly sinks down from the ocean above, recycling those scarce nutrients back into the broader ecosystem, so that almost nothing ever goes to waste. Researchers studying this bacterial mat describe it as one of the primary reasons life is able to persist at all in a place with almost no natural food supply reaching it. Just recently, researchers announced yet another entirely new species pulled from these depths, a small bioluminescent creature that immediately raised fresh questions about deep-sea conservation, given how quickly human activity, from plastic pollution to emerging interest in deep-sea mining, is starting to reach even the most remote corners of the planet. Around that same period, researchers working in a neighboring trench recorded a new snailfish sighting at an even greater depth than the original Mariana specimen, breaking the previous record for the deepest living vertebrate ever documented. Every single one of these expeditions keeps confirming the same basic pattern. The deeper we look, the more life we keep finding, not less. You would honestly expect the deepest, most remote, most isolated point on our entire planet to be one of the last untouched places left on Earth. It's not. In 2020, researchers discovered a brand new species of amphipod living in the Mariana Trench. And when they examined its tissue closely under a microscope, they found something they genuinely didn't expect: tiny fragments of plastic already embedded directly inside its body. The researchers who identified this species made a deliberate choice with its scientific name, calling it Eurythenes plasticus, naming a species on purpose after the pollution already found inside it, as a way of highlighting just how far plastic contamination had already spread, nearly 7 kilometers beneath the ocean surface, into a habitat that had barely even been studied by humans before this discovery. The marine ecologist who led that research pointed out something genuinely worth sitting with: that this was a brand new species pulled from one of the least explored habitats on Earth, and it was already contaminated before scientists ever had a real chance to study it in anything resembling its natural, untouched state. Other expeditions to the trench have since documented microplastics scattered directly into the seafloor sediment, along with photographed plastic bags and packaging resting near the very bottom of the Challenger Deep itself, the same kind of debris Victor Vescovo's team reported spotting during those 2019 dives. A long-running research effort called the Mariana Trench Environment and Ecology Research Project set out to study sediment samples pulled directly from the trench, alongside other extreme deep-sea locations scattered around the world. What the team found was genuinely staggering. Over 7,000 new microbial species were identified, roughly 90% of which had never once been recorded or formally classified before this project even began. Thousands of entirely new organisms pulled from sediment samples taken in a place most of us had simply assumed was empty. When scientists studied the genetics of these microbes more closely, they found something else worth paying attention to. Many of them carry genes specifically designed to break down harmful byproducts created inside their own cells, chemicals called reactive oxygen species that, left unchecked in most living things, damage DNA and accelerate aging over time. These deep trench organisms also appeared to have unusually strong systems for continuously repairing their own DNA, something researchers believe helps them survive constant exposure to crushing pressure and near-freezing temperatures across their entire lifespan. Researchers involved in this project have suggested that this kind of work could eventually contribute to genuinely new medical treatments, or even help support the future of human space travel. Surviving extreme pressure, extreme isolation, and constant cellular stress is exactly the kind of problem astronauts face on long-duration missions. In other words, we may end up learning how humans could eventually survive deep space by first studying organisms that have never once seen the sky. For decades now, we've pointed telescopes and rovers outward, searching distant planets and moons for any sign of life, any microbe, any hint at all, however small, that we're genuinely not alone in this universe. This entire time, our own ocean floor has been quietly hiding armored shrimp built partly from metal, a glowing jellyfish nobody has ever been able to name, a fish that falls apart the moment you remove the exact pressure that built its body in the first place, a single cell the size of a mango doing the work of an entire organism, and thousands of microscopic species we didn't even know existed until researchers finally looked closely enough to find them. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, less than 5% of our ocean floor has been properly explored. Let that number sit for a second. That means the vast majority of the Mariana Trench, and nearly all of the ocean beyond it, remains completely unmapped and unstudied to this day. We genuinely don't know what else is down there. We don't know how many more species are drifting past cameras that have simply never been sent that deep in the first place. In parts of the trench, nobody has ever visited even once. Only 4 human beings in all of history have ever laid eyes on the bottom of the Challenger. Deep directly, Picard and Walsh in that cracked, terrifying steel sphere back in 1960, James Cameron alone in 2012, and Victor Vescovo, who has now returned to it more times than anyone else combined. Even the handful of vehicles capable of reaching those depths today remain almost absurdly rare and expensive, with each dive requiring years of engineering, months of preparation, and a level of financial and technical risk that keeps most of the ocean floor permanently out of reach for the foreseeable future. Space is enormous, and it's absolutely worth continuing to explore. Nobody's arguing otherwise here, but right now, today, there's an entire alien world sitting at the very bottom of our own planet, one that's been sitting there the whole time, quietly building fish out of pressure and shrimp out of metal, simply waiting for someone to finally point a camera in its direction, patiently sitting in total darkness through wars, empires, and entire centuries of human history that never once reached down far enough to notice it was there. Every single expedition that goes back down there seems to come back with something nobody predicted, which really tells you everything about how much guesswork is still involved in describing a place we've technically known about for well over a century.